Welcome to part 10 of the Peloponnesian War. We come now to the siege of Syracuse, and that lasted 2 brutal years, from 414 to 413 BC, and that's what we're going to cover in this video. Now, as we talked about in the last video, the Athenians won the first battle, but they failed to finish off the Syracusans. And so the Athenians set up winter quarters to the north of Syracuse. Now, in the spring of 414 BC, the Athenians arrived back at Syracuse to set up the siege. And I can tell you that this siege was one of the great sieges in antiquity, and it had a monumental impact on the Peloponnesian War. Now, this siege is one of the most complicated sieges in history. There were all of these siege walls and counter walls being built, so I will do my best to explain this entire situation as it went down. Now, I'm going to use this same map for the rest of this video to try and explain this entire situation. Now, as I said, the Athenians arrived in the spring of 414 BC. Now, since Athens already had Syracuse blocked by sea, they now wanted to construct a siege wall, and if that occurred, Syracuse probably would have been forced to sign a treaty. Now, the first thing the Athenians did was build a supply depot at Labdalum, and you can see that right here on the map. Now, Labdalum was built on this plateau, and that is colored in beige on this map, so you can see that right here on this map. And that plateau is an elevated plateau, so there are a series of cliffs that surround the entire plateau. So it was an elevated plateau, as I said. And by the way, the name of this plateau is Epipoli. Now, around this time, the Athenians also received some reinforcements, and with this additional manpower, the Athenians built another fort, which has since been called the Circle. And you can see that on the map right here. Now, this was going to be the main fort of the entire siege. Now, the intent here was that there would be 2 walls, one going north and one going south towards the Great Harbor. And so the Athenians wanted to finish those 2 walls as fast as possible to enclose Syracuse. Now, the wall to the north would extend up to the Mediterranean Sea, and the wall to the south would extend to the Great Harbor. And part of that wall would be built over a marsh, which you can see marked in dark green right here. Now, Syracuse could see what was going on from their city walls, and they were absolutely terrified that they might be cut off by land. And so their primary objective was to keep the road open by land to their city. And so they began to construct their own counterwall, which you can see here in red. Now, the first counterwall that the Syracusans built blocked the Athenian wall heading to the south. And then this bizarre episode occurred where both sides seemed content to let the other side work on their walls for a while. And so no attacks were launched to prevent construction from going on. Now, the Athenians noticed that the Syracusans were not defending the walls that they had just constructed. And so 300 Athenians launched a surprise attack and actually destroyed a portion of the first Syracusan counterwall. And with that, the Syracusans had to flee back to their main wall. And so the Athenians continued construction on their wall over the marsh. But the Syracusans didn't give up, and they started work on a second counterwall, building it across the marsh. And again, the intent was to disrupt the construction of the Athenian southern wall. And the Athenians launched yet another surprise attack, and the Syracusans fled. And so you get an idea of all the skirmishes that are going on here, along with all of these walls that are being built. Now, the Syracusans, after this second attack, were split into 2 main groups. One headed back to the city, and the other headed back to the Syracusan fort Olympium. Now, the Syracusans that were heading back to the fort at Olympium were hotly pursued by 300 Athenians, with the main Athenian army right behind them. Now, the Athenians wanted to cut off the retreating Syracusans before they could retreat past the Anapus River. But the Syracusan cavalry, which was a constant menace to the Athenians, saved the day by attacking the first 300 Athenians and then the main army. And actually, they turned the situation completely around, and the Athenians actually began to retreat. Now, Lamachus was actually able to stabilize the Athenian lines, but he was killed in the process. And that left only Nicias in command. And you will remember that there were 3 original commanders, Lamachus, Alcibiades, and Nicias. And so the other 2 now were out of the picture. And as I said, that left Nicias in command. Now, with the Athenian main army away from their main fort, the Syracusans launched a counterattack at the Circle fort and were able to destroy some of the wall on the plateau of Epipoli. Now, Nicias was able to stop the Syracusan attack by ordering some of the wooden supplies in the fort to be set on fire. And this bought the Athenians a little bit of time until their main army was able to arrive back at the circle. At around this time, the Athenian navy arrived in the Great Harbor, and with that threat, the Syracusans were forced to retreat back to the city. And with that, the Athenians were able to complete a double wall to the south. And that gave their fort added protection. And they utilized wooden planks to get across the wet marsh. Now, with two walls, the Athenians would be able to receive supplies from the sea unhindered by the Syracusans. Now, if the Athenians were able to complete their wall north, a disaster threatened to sweep away Syracuse, and they almost certainly would have been forced to sign a peace treaty. Now, you will remember in the last video, the Spartans dispatched a small fleet to assist Syracuse. It was led by Gylippus, and it was around this time that the fleet first stopped at Tarentum and then at Thurii, and so they were well on their way to Sicily. Now, Gylippus and his small fleet arrived to find Syracuse blockaded by sea, so they basically couldn't pull into the Great Harbor. But they were able to land further down the coast and enter the city by land, since the Athenians had failed to finish off their wall to the north. Additional help would also arrive from the Corinthians, who sent supplies and ships. Now, Syracuse at this time was seriously entertaining surrendering to the Athenians, but the arrival of a Spartan general ended all discussions of peace, and Gylippus was able to whip the Syracusans back into shape, and he put them firmly back on a war footing. Now, Gylippus responded boldly. He first captured the Athenian fort at Labdalum, and that was a real problem for the Athenians because that was one of their key supply depots. Gylippus also realized that the key to the entire battle was to block the Athenian wall heading north. And so he started construction on a third counterwall that would run across the plain of Epipoli. And if he was able to complete this wall, it would basically end the siege of Syracuse. Now, for whatever reason, Nicias did nothing to prevent Gylippus from building the third counterwall. Instead, he decided to build 3 forts at Plemmyrium, which you can see right down here on the map. Now, this would give the Athenians a safe exit from Sicily if they needed to retreat, but the Athenians didn't come here to build forts. They came here to win the war with Syracuse. But all this did was take away valuable supplies that could have been used on the northern wall. And so once again, Nicias was being too conservative. And it was these conservative decisions that would cost the Athenians greatly during the siege of Syracuse. Eventually, Nicias decided that he had to stop the third counterwall from being constructed. And so 2 battles broke out up north. The first was won by the Athenians, but the second was won by Gylippus. And it was that victory that allowed Syracuse to finish off the third counterwall. And this was a disaster for the Athenians, as it essentially rendered their entire siege strategy useless. And it got worse as Gylippus actually was able to build a fort at Euryleus. And so you can see now the Syracusans had 3 forts from which they could attack the Athenians from. The Syracusans received more good news when the Corinthians arrived, making the Peloponnesian navy even stronger. And suddenly it seemed the hunters were becoming the hunted. Now, at the end of 414 BC, both sides took up winter quarters. Nicias sent word back to Athens asking for permission to leave the island or for Athens to send more reinforcements. Now, even though the situation on land was not going well, the Athenians still dominated the sea around Sicily. Now, amazingly, the Athenian assembly still refused to give up. Demosthenes and Eurymedon were assigned the task to lead a new Athenian contingent to Sicily. Around this time, the Spartans, acting on Alcibiades' advice, seized Decelia in 413 BC, and this cut off Athens from several of their all-important silver mines. And since the bulk of the Athenian army was pinned down in Sicily, they were not in much of a position to do anything about it. And so this put a serious strain on the Athenian war treasury, which was close to depletion. And so with this new Spartan attack, the peace of Nicias was, for all intents and purposes, over. Now, back in Sicily, Gylippus had recruited more Sicilian allies to take up the cause against the Athenians. He also implored Syracuse to put as much into their fleet as possible, knowing that in order to win the battle outright, they needed to defeat Athens at sea. Now, in the spring of 413 BC, Gylippus launched a combined sea and land attack, with the overall intention of taking Plemmyrium. The Athenian navy was able to defeat the sea attack, but while the Athenians were busy at sea, Gylippus was able to launch the planned sneak attack on Plemmyrium and took all 3 forts. Now the situation was becoming very perilous, because the circle fort was now surrounded by several enemy forts. Thucydides indicated that the morale of the Athenian army plummeted after the loss of Plemmyrium. Now during this time, Gylippus was receiving more and more reinforcements by the day, and the Syracusan navy was becoming stronger and stronger. And so Gylippus launched constant attacks against the Athenian fleet in the Great Harbor. Now, in order to defeat the Athenians, the Syracusans made some changes to their bows. What they did was they made them thicker so they could take advantage of the close quarters fighting in the harbor. Now, thicker bows gave the Syracusan boats a greater advantage in ramming, and ramming was pretty much the primary tactic in ancient naval warfare. And so as a result, the Syracusans had a distinct advantage over the Athenians at sea. And with these new improvements to their boats, the Syracusans attacked the Athenians. And so a major battle broke out in the Great Harbor. And eventually the Athenians were driven back from the harbor. This made the land forces very vulnerable, because their entire lifeline was the Athenian navy. And so now all they controlled was this thin stretch of land between their 2 double walls. Now Demosthenes arrived in the nick of time. And with these additional reinforcements, the Athenians were able to gain control of the sea. Now Demosthenes decided to do what Nicias failed to do, immediately attempt to destroy the 3rd counterwall that Gylippus had built. And after that task had been accomplished, the Athenian north wall could then be completed. Now Demosthenes launched a daring nighttime raid with nearly 20,000 soldiers, and initially he was very successful in capturing the 3rd Syracusan counterwall. But Thucydides indicates the Athenians became confident of victory, and it's always very dangerous to become drunk with victory. And once Gylippus recovered from the initial shock of the attack, he was able to reorganize his forces and repulse the Athenian attack. This forced the Athenians to retreat in complete disarray. Many Athenians got lost at night on the plain of Epipoli, and in the confusion, nearly 2,000 Athenian men were killed by the Syracusans. So what started out as a potential turning point turned out to be a catastrophe for the Athenians. And so after that setback, the Athenian morale was nearly at rock bottom. Demosthenes now realized the situation was hopeless and pushed for the Athenians to sail home while the opportunity remained. Amazingly, Nicias argued to stay in Syracuse. Nicias won out and the siege went on. Now, Nicias was probably operating out of fear of what the Athenian assembly might do to him if he returned empty-handed, and so he thought it best to stay in Syracuse. But the problem here was that Syracuse and the Peloponnesians were growing stronger by the day, while the Athenians were becoming weaker and weaker. Finally, Nicias sided with Demosthenes, but he ominously decided to wait 10 days before the evacuation would begin. Now, the Syracusans learned that the Athenians were going to attempt an escape, and so they launched a massive attack. Both walls were attacked, and the Syracusans threw everything they had at sea against the Athenian navy. The Athenian navy was broken and was forced to make a landing on the beach between their 2 southern walls. This was the first serious defeat for the Athenian navy. Although the Athenians still had several ships, they found themselves now blockaded in the Great Harbor. The only chance of escape now was for the Athenians to force a breakout of the Great Harbor. But there was a problem. The Syracusans had set up a line of defense that you can see right here on the map. Nonetheless, the Athenians decided to break out of the encirclement, and so a huge battle took place at the mouth of the Great Harbor. The close quarters fighting, however, favored the Syracusan vessels because of those new thickened bows that had been installed. So at the end of the day, the Syracusan blockade remained intact, and the Athenians were forced yet again back to their camp. Nicias and Demosthenes debated what to do next, and Nicias decided that the best thing to do was to attempt a retreat towards Catana in the north, and of course that meant a retreat by land. But the Athenians were constantly harassed by the Syracusan cavalry, and eventually both Nicias and Demosthenes were captured and executed. The remaining Athenians were forced into slave mines, and many would die there. In fact, Thucydides indicates that many of the Athenian soldiers would die within just a matter of months in those slave mines. And so it was a total defeat and total catastrophe for the Athenians. This would be the major turning point in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians not only lost some of their best generals, they lost thousands of hoplites, but it was the triremes that could not be replaced. The Athenians lost hundreds of triremes during the invasion of Sicily, and so the Athenian navy was never the same after the siege of Syracuse. Okay, that is going to do it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video.